So I'm here today with Stephen Batchelor, who is a translator, a teacher, artist, and writer, who is the most well-known, prominent developer and advocate of a secular approach to the Dharma. His books include Buddhism Without Beliefs, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, After Buddhism, and Secular Buddhism. And his most recent publication was The Art of Solitude. Stephen is a co-founder of Bodhi College, which provides online and in-person courses which focus on the exploration of early Buddhist teachings, which are the basis of many contemporary forms of practice today, including mindfulness and Vipassana. So Stephen, thank you very much for joining with me today. And I know you've seen the whole sort of development of a secular approach to Dharma. I mean, you were the person who began to think in those terms and began to develop this kind of approach. And it's now probably over 20 years where the notion of a secular approach to Dharma has become prominent. What is your sense of the development of the history of secular Buddhism? If you could just give us some.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for inviting me to this conversation. The question as to the origins and the history of secular Buddhism is very long on the one hand and very short on the other. The short version you just gave, it's a term that's been around for maybe 20 years, if that. But I think we have to return also to the beginnings of this tradition, where we have Gautama, the Buddha, laying out a vision for the kind of community that he envisaged. And that was a community that he thought of as a fourfold assembly in which monastics and lay people would have equivalent roles. He doesn't set out a community where we have religious professionals on the one hand, and then we have their lay supporters who provide for them and finance their operations and so forth. But we have a much more inclusive and egalitarian kind of community that's envisaged. Over the course of history, early Indian Buddhist history particularly, we see that vision fading from view quite quickly, I feel. And we find Buddhism evolving into another Indian religion with the same goals as Brahmanism and Jainism, which were the two major traditions with which it found itself, which sought as the goal of practice the liberation from the cycle of birth and death, the attainment of some eternal nibbana, and effectively a move away from the concerns of this world to the concerns of transcendence, of going beyond life on earth and aspiring for something greater. Now, throughout the history of Buddhism from then on, we do get periodically movements that resisted this tendency. The most famous one, of course, being the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, which sought to shift the emphasis back towards compassion, concern for the suffering of others, the Bodhisattva vow, which continue to this day to be very inspirational elements within all forms of Buddhism. But nonetheless, the Mahayana movement did not significantly challenge the religious status quo on the one hand, with monks and lay people quite separated, nor did it really challenge some of the assumptions that had become built into Buddhism at that time, namely that the goal of the Eightfold Path is to attain nirvana and no longer to be born. The difference being that in the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva works for all beings to be liberated from birth and death, to attain nirvana before that person will attain nibbana themselves. But so in other words, it leaves intact the idea that the highest good is not flourishing on this earth, the highest good is not being born at all. Now, that model has remained largely in place up until today. However, there are movements in Japan particularly, where there was a more explicit break with that religious model of Buddhism. And we find figures like Shinran and Nichiren, particularly in 14th century Japan, making a rather more radical break with many of the norms of religious Buddhism. Shinran leaves the monastic order. He goes to work with the poor in Kyoto and founds what is now known as the Pure Land School, which is very much a movement dedicated to working in the world. And this is perhaps even more true with Nichiren Daishonin, who founded the movements that carry still his name, the Nichiren movements, and which in Japan became extremely popular in the wake of the Second World War, so that today we now have an organization called the Soka Gakkai, which has cut itself off from the religious priesthood of the Nichiren school. In fact, it was evicted, it was kicked out of the Nichiren community of priests, and is now actually offering what I think is in many ways the most visible form of secular Buddhism that we currently know. Its teachings have extended across the world, and it has movements pretty much everywhere, particularly still very strong in Japan. But the Nichiren movement and the Pure Land movements have not moved in terms of their philosophy and their worldview really much beyond traditional Buddhist views. They still believe in reincarnation and rebirth and the general worldview of Buddhism. So the contemporary secular Buddhist movement, and perhaps we should highlight that as a contemporary movement that is not struggling with issues in 14th century Japan, but is seeking to apply a Buddhist perspective to the issues of the 20th and the 21st centuries of a globalized modernity, finds itself, I think, with a much greater challenge. It's not a question of just separating yourself from the monks. That's relatively straightforward. And when we look at the Vipassana communities that are flourishing all over the place, relatively few of them are run by monastics. Monasticism has not really taken off yet in the West to any significant degree. But what we do find, I think, in modernity is a much greater skepticism amongst the broad community of those who are drawn to Buddhist ideals and practices about the elements of the underlying worldview. In other words, reincarnation, the law of karma, different realms of existence. This is all very much a legacy of ancient Indian cosmology and does not really make a great deal of sense to many people who live in our world today. In addition to that, we have a scientific worldview that has emerged over the last couple of hundred years, which is cast in a very, very compelling light, a view of human evolution, the evolution of life through natural selection, an enormously expanded notion of our place in the cosmos, in the galaxy, in the universe, that really renders a lot of the standard Buddhist tropes about the meaning of life as somewhat questionable. So the secular Buddhism of our time, which I think both you and I are both in some ways committed to, is one that's actually actually calling upon the need to go back to the very beginnings of the Dharma and perhaps to start again. And it's for this reason that although paradoxically we're at a long way away from the 5th century BC, I do find that by going back to that period, by uncovering the historical Buddha as far as we can, and trying to identify what were his key ideas that were not derivative of Indian culture, we have, I think, a fairly solid core of values, ideas, philosophies, practices that we can turn quite easily into a thoroughgoing secularity, or let's say a secular perspective that can inform a Buddhism, a dharma of our time. To what extent we should continue calling this Buddhism is questionable. Secular dharma, as I almost prefer now, doesn't have a great deal in common in many respects with what most people understand as Buddhism. And Buddhism, in many ways, still perpetuates a certain view of the world that secular dharma has left behind.
Okay. As you've developed this approach and others have worked with you on this, there's been a fairly significant pushback from folks who support a more, the more traditional religious version of Buddhism. And of course, you've had a number of dialogues and debates with representatives of that perspective. How do you see that evolving, that sort of dialogue between those who support a secular approach and more traditional Buddhism? Has it changed much since you began to present those ideas, or has it gotten more intense? There was a recent book that came out called Secularizing Buddhism by Shambhala Press, which had a pretty negative perspective on your views and on secular Buddhism. In some ways, it was very much a distortion of what secular dharma is trying to accomplish and its perspective. So, what's your sense of? Do you see the opposition getting stronger, and how do you relate to it personally? Because some of it is an attack on yourself.
Well, again, as you might expect, I'm very curious as to how the traditional Buddhist world are, receiving some of these new ideas. And you're quite right in pointing out that there are many spokespeople of those traditions who are really seem to be quite disturbed and irritated by this secular approach. In the book you mentioned, there is an essay by a man called Philippe Turenne, which is purportedly a conversation with my form of Buddhism, or Stephen Batchelor's secular Buddhism. And one of the things that he tries to answer in that question is, why do the writings of Stephen Batchelor lead to people becoming extremely irritated? And he really, I think, is curious. He doesn't really have an answer to that. And he does explore it, I think, in some ways quite well. But for me, the person in question, it is very odd to think that, I'm just sitting in my office writing my books and reading other people's books and trying to meditate a bit and be a good person. And yet there's some group of people out in some Buddhist center in Nepal who are getting extremely irritated about something I might have written 10 years ago, for all I know. So what is it that's being irritated? What is it that people don't like? What is it that prompts the knee-jerk negative reaction that is so widespread? I think some of the people who best understand what I'm doing are those who like it the least. And so people like Bhikkhu Bodhi and others who are, very, very accomplished and learned Buddhist scholars, they can see what's going on. I think probably a lot better than others who may not have that sort of background, but who just find that what I'm saying contradicts with what their own teacher may have said. I think the root of the problem lies in the fact that secular Buddhism, as I'm developing it, operates according to a different operating system, a different core logic. And once you accept and understand how that core logic differs, then you begin to realize that traditional Buddhism operates according to a different kind of core logic that sends it off effectively into towards the goal of some kind of transcendence. In other words, we start with suffering, and that's all human life is suffering, the causes of suffering, craving and ignorance. You then get rid of the cause of suffering, craving and ignorance, means you get rid of suffering, means you're not born again, and everybody lives eternally forever after. That is a view of the world that is underpinned by a certain core way of thinking about what you're doing. Now, probably the vast majority of people who practice mindfulness and go to Buddhist centers and so on don't actually think of those things a great deal. These are really ideas that are the preserve of what in Christianity would be called theologians. And I think of myself as a kind of Buddhist theologian. I'm fascinated with the core logic that defines and that underpins the whole way in which your scheme of beliefs and practices makes sense to you. If we turn the core logic from one that is a logic of transcendence, about ending suffering, to a secular approach, which I would argue operates according to a logic of care. So in other words, rather than having as your goal the elimination of suffering, the ending of suffering, it has as its goal the embracing of suffering, the responding to suffering, not in some abstract sense, but caring for and responding to specific instances of suffering that occur in your own felt life, in your own personal life, in your social life, in your political life. In other words, the suffering that is instantiated in human and animal and other experiences on planet Earth right now. So the core logic of secular dharma is one that starts with the embracing of suffering, which leads to a different relationship to life, in which you begin to question your habitual reactive patterns of greed and hatred and so on, letting that die down, opening up a space in which you can be more non-reactive, and from that non-reactive space, responding to the specific situations of suffering, from the most personal to the most global in a way, and learning, therefore, to cultivate a way of life, a path, both individually and in terms of a community, a sangha, that is supporting each other in that practice. Now, if I'm correct here, then I think effectively these two approaches are incompatible. They simply do not marry very well at all. And that leads me more and more to realizing that a secular dharma may very well end up decoupling itself from Buddhism or traditional Buddhism, and perhaps dropping the word Buddhist altogether. There are certain disadvantages to that, namely that we don't have that immediate name recognition that the word Buddhist grants us, even though we may not go along with a lot of Buddhist ideas. And it kind of puts you out into it opens up a new field that is clearly rooted historically in the Buddhist traditions, but no longer seems to be playing the same language game, or the same language game as Wittgenstein would have put it. And it's opening up the possibility of generating a form of thinking, a form of practice, a form of ethics, a form of social and political engagement that is premised on a different set of assumptions from traditional Buddhism. So I think the reason people get deeply irritated by what I'm doing, even if they don't understand the underpinning logic, is that they can sort of feel and sense that this is a different kind of beast, that secular Buddhism is a different kind of animal. It doesn't behave and react in the way that Buddhist animals normally do. It does other stuff which we don't really quite understand and which don't sometimes make sense and seem to be rejecting extraordinarily central common positions that the Buddhist community has held for hundreds of years, like particularly dispensing with the Four Noble Truths, for example, which is the key example of the logic of transcendence that secular Buddhism is departing from.
I think that's very true, and and I think that these issues, of course, are never just matters of rationality and intellect. There's also, in some ways, a deep emotional attachment that people have to these core logics, and it's to some extent that the approach that you're describing, sort of new operating system, is in fundamental conflict with, what for many people are deeply held, attachments, connections with certain beliefs, particularly around, as you say, nirvana and karma and so forth. So, yeah, it becomes almost for many people kind of an existential sort of conflict. So I want to get back to, you mentioned the notion of care, which, as you say, sort of underpins a crucial concept for a secular approach to the Dharma. And I think we can also relate that to the idea of its care as part of a process of trying to promote human flourishing in the world. I think you would agree with that. So I wanted to ask you, and what your thoughts are. I mean, we've got so many tremendous problems today in the world, from climate crisis to social inequality, and not to ask you to give a blueprint for for solving these problems, but just in general, how do you see a secular approach to the Dharma contributing to sort of facilitating a wiser response to these issues? Again, without needing to deal with the details so much, but just as an approach, how do you see the secular Buddhists or secular Dharma practitioners make a fruitful contribution to these problems?
Well, as you say, this is a huge issue, and I'm not going to do anything but scratch the surface of it and maybe just float a few suggestions. But I think the starting point really is to acknowledge that secular Dharma is concerned exclusively with the fate of life on this particular planet and nothing else. It is agnostic, really, as to what happens after death, but agnostic, again, doesn't mean you're equally balanced as to there being life after death or not. No, I think we have to take into account what we understand of our neurobiology, of the structure of the brain, the evolution of the person as a social creature, and so on, to realize that there's, in my perspective, it's very, very unlikely that I'll be reborn in any meaningful sense. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the consequences of my actions now do not have consequences on generations who will come to live in this place and in the world after my death. So there's no problem at all. And this is one of the criticisms you get. If you don't believe in the continuity of life after death, then what will be the basis for your ethics and so on? I don't really find that at all compelling, because whether or not you continue as a reincarnating entity, the consequences of your acts clearly will. And we can see this now, particularly in terms of climate change. The consequences of our economic and political behavior at present are laying the foundations for disasters and maybe even premature extinction of the human race within the next 100 years or so. Some of the projections now are bringing this cataclysm even closer to us in terms of time, but let's say in the next 100 years or so. So in other words, we're now in a position where I think we have a much clearer sense of what our actions as individuals and as communities are liable to inflict on those who come to live here after our death. And so by envisaging a form of dharma that puts its attention fairly and squarely on this life, this world, the kinds of creatures that over millions of years have evolved on this planet and whose existences are now under threat, that I think provides a powerful, not just an adequate, but an even more powerful frame for a practice of life that values wisdom and compassion and tolerance and care and these virtues that we find in Buddhism. And it has, I think, the additional advantage of not being premised on a belief. I believe that there will be, I will be reborn in a future life or something, but this is actually founded on the broad consensus of scientific opinion over now the last 50 years. We likewise are increasingly made aware of the extraordinarily destructive consequence of war. We see a war now raging not far from where I'm speaking in France, and we can see very clearly the knock-on effects environmentally, economically, in terms of food access and so forth and so on. So we don't need, as perhaps ancient India and other cultures needed, some sort of bigger picture that requires many lifetimes in which to somehow give our practice here and now some weight. We have, I think, ample evidence now of our place in the world and what we're doing to the world that I think can sustain a deep and committed practice to the Dharma. But I think also it does require that we do seriously learn how to rethink our practice of the Dharma. And that requires, in some cases, unlearning what Buddhism has taught you. In my own case, I spent 10 years, the whole period of my life during my 20s, as a monk, studying different forms of Buddhism. And I think it took me another 20 years at least to begin to decondition myself from that way of thinking. Because people are taught Buddhism in perfectly good faith by entirely honorable teachers who are not seeking to pull the wool over their eyes or mislead them, but are genuinely motivated by concern and compassion to teach Buddhism. And we often take on board those ideas at moments of great crisis and vulnerability in ourselves. So it's not surprising that we become attached to some of these ideas, some of which I think settle inside us almost at a level that is unconscious or subconscious in some way. So we're not even aware that we're thinking in that way. It just seems natural. It seems, a matter of course. And also, of course, that to recognize that people are drawn to Buddhism for many, many different reasons, and probably relatively few people are drawn to Buddhism because of their interest in Buddhist philosophy. The chances are Buddhism meets emotional needs, and they might be to do with learning to find a greater sense of peace and acceptance psychologically within yourself. They apply also to social needs, to feel part of a community, to feel part of a body of people who are committed to the same values. And it's not easy to somehow just let all that go. And so although you might not agree with a lot of the doctrines, you might struggle with the idea of reincarnation, in the end, the strength of the community, the friendships, the meditation practices, the retreats, all of these things outweigh that in significance to your philosophical worries. And a lot of traditional Buddhist teachers will say, oh, if you have difficulty with this idea, don't worry about it. But the problem with that is that you are somehow still reinforcing and strengthening a particular worldview of which you may not actually be terribly conscious, simply by your participation in these traditional forms of the Buddhist religion. So people, I think, are sometimes reluctant to, as it were, leave that all behind and embrace a secular dharma that doesn't provide you with gorgeous temples and rituals and large communities and so forth and so on, but it's rather a solitary affair that largely exists online in discussions such as this. So it's always, I think, rather it's rather uncomfortable and even a little scary sometimes to leave behind the consolations of religion and embark on a path where you're kind of on your own more. You're with a relatively small group of people who think in the same way. And you may not actually really quite get why these philosophical issues matter. That may not actually really, people will think, well, Four Noble Truths, four tasks, they're just different ways of saying the same thing. I've heard that quite a lot too, that why make a fuss about all that? Why bother rethinking the whole of Buddhism when on most levels, the old model works perfectly well?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to follow up on that, when you see the groups of people, mostly online now, particularly because of COVID, who are interested in a secular approach to dharma, in some sense, we are having to sort of create this movement, again, without, having sort of the institutions and the sort of the existing structures. And I think that is difficult, and it certainly is provides less assurance about what we're doing. But in some ways, I find that to be more exciting, more positive, because we are actually sort of creating it together, right? Mm-hmm. As we discuss, and it's not clear where this quite leads. As you say, maybe it means decoupling from Buddhism in some ways, or again, how does it connect with other perspectives of psychology and politics and so forth? I wanted to ask you that in terms of your sense of the secular dharma is evolving at this point. Would you like to see it sort of take on a more institutional role, or do you think it's just where it is now is where it needs to be, at least for the near future?
Well, I mean, there's nothing much I can really do about it. I'm fully aware that I don't have the set of skills needed to set up a big Buddhist movement or organization. And I'm in awe, frankly, of those Buddhist teachers who seem to do this quite effortlessly. I just don't have that, I'm afraid. So it's not really something that really crosses my mind. Added to the fact that I've always found any involvement in Buddhist institutions something that in the end I've started rebelling against. There's a reluctance to somehow move towards institutionalization, which means making certain things more normative, defining yourself perhaps more and more in contrast to others, becoming a little bit more self-standing, independent body of something or other. And then you have all of the brick and mortar problems of owning property and everything that comes in the wake of that. Now, of course, that might happen at some point. I've no idea. If I think of someone like Nichiren, he's someone who basically at the end of his life was living in a little hut with a few followers, nothing much was going on. And it took another 600 years before his teachings suddenly burst onto the scene. And I don't think, one should perhaps try to think in those terms as well, that my own work I really see as just following through everything I've been studying and thinking about and learning over the last 50 years and trying to sort of articulate it in a way that addresses the concerns of our time. And that's my job, as it were, I feel, as a writer and a thinker. But it's really not my business to consider, how that's going to find some form in a society. I'm quite happy with the way things are moving along in their slightly slow and muddled way. Certainly in the last 10 or so years, there's been quite an expansion of people who formerly belong to different social Buddhist networks. Also, another thing that I'm experimenting and exploring now is to develop a more systematic training program, which I'm calling mindfulness-based human flourishing. And in October, with the Buddha Stiftung in Germany, I'm going to offer 4 consecutive weekends to explore what that might look like. And maybe that will form a model that will be somewhere between secular Dharma and traditional Buddhism, and also the mindfulness community as well, that might enable another way of practicing and thinking about this material to evolve. I honestly don't know. We will wait and see what happens from that. But I do have a very strong intuitive conviction that this is the way to go. I feel very confident in that. But apart from that, I don't really know. I recently spoke with my mentor and friend, Don Cupid, the Anglican theologian whose work mirrors mine in many ways, or I should say my work mirrors his, I think, really. Don once told me that he too didn't have organizational skills and could not possibly have done something like Luther did, which was both to rethink Christian doctrine, to translate the Bible, and to establish a church. That's really quite mind-boggling how a single person can pull that off. But at the same time, Don, when I spoke to him just a few weeks ago, he's now 89, he was saying, I don't think that in our lifetime people will really come in large numbers to these ideas. It's something he feels that will perhaps grow over the next generation or two. Maybe. I frankly don't know. When I look at John Kabat-Zinn's work, he probably didn't think in the early 80s that mindfulness-based stress reduction would somehow become a global phenomenon. So we really cannot tell how these things will unfold. All I think that I can do, and maybe the few of us who are committed to this path can do, is to pursue our convictions and our faith, as it were, full-heartedly, with as much energy and time as we can dedicate to them, and leave behind us as much as we can possibly do that might make a difference in the lives of those who live on after we're gone.
You mentioned mindfulness-based human flourishing. We're going to be doing a 4-part workshop, Buddha Stiftung, in October. And do you see that as, in some ways, an alternative to mindfulness-based stress reduction programs? Because I think it's a wonderful idea. In other words, it's sort of mindfulness, but it's going to have obviously an ethical component. It's going to have a philosophical component, which in some of the MBSR, it's one of the critiques of the MBSR programs that they lack that to some extent. So did you sort of come up with, is this idea something did you see that as an alternative to MBSR, or just tell us a little more about that?
I don't so much see it as an alternative either to MBSR or to MBCT or to the other mindfulness-based interventions that are continuously emerging. And I don't think of it as an alternative. I think of it as perhaps the next step that could be taken. And on the other hand, I'm very clearly conscious that I want to take this mindfulness-based living out of a medicalized framework. That's where, I mean, MBSR, MBCT are both basically forms of medical intervention at the outset. And yet, as we know, people do them for medical reasons and end up finding that this actually affords them another perspective on their whole lives. That mindfulness is not only useful just to deal with anxiety attacks, but to deal with most things. So for some, maybe a small percentage, it opens a door to something else. But as of now, there's really not elsewhere to go. Some of these people end up in Buddhist centers and are often not particularly happy with that. They don't really find what they're looking for. They find another religion. They don't want to become Buddhists or join another religious organization, but they are looking for something. So I think of mindfulness-based human flourishing as the next step for people who have arrived at these Buddhist practices through MBSR and so forth. But also, I think of it as a freestanding project, a freestanding approach that would not require any previous forms of mindfulness-based practices. Perhaps it would be something that would be a helpful way for people who are frustrated by their Buddhist practice to shift to something more secular. But the problem is, Mike, I came up with the idea. I thought this sounds like a good idea. And now I've got to figure out what it means. And that's what, well, not so much what it means, but how you can apply it.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
well, you know, well, I was just going to say that I've noticed with the groups that have formed around the secular Buddhist network and our discussion groups and meditation group, that there's a fair number of people who do come from MBSR programs and are looking for something more, but are a little put off by the sort of traditional, versions of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And I think, what's really promising about this mindfulness-based human flourishing is that maybe, as you say, you're trying to work on it and sort of fill in the content for it. Maybe that's something that, those of us throughout the world who are interested in secular dharma, and maybe that can become sort of one of the things that we can discuss and see what makes sense. So and work with you on that. So,
well, funnily enough, that's my current thinking too. I would take it even a little bit further. I'm thinking of running these 4 workshops as basically a kind of invitation to the participants to develop such a program of mindfulness-based human flourishing, not to think of it as another project for me to do much more about. I just like to, in a way, start a ball rolling. And if the community, the secular Buddhist community, could come together around this idea and further develop it in different ways, that would, for me, be the ideal outcome. In other words, the community would take it forward rather than one person.
I think you find a lot of people who would be interested in doing that.
I hope. I have a funny feeling that that's true too. And I'll certainly, in the course, be inviting the participants to get involved if they would like to develop this further and not wait for someone to think it out for them.
So, Stephen, it's been wonderful to talk today. And thank you so much for offering your views on the secular dharma and also some of the things you said in the beginning, sort of the history of sort of the antecedents of earlier. So I think, unless you want to say anything more, I think we're done for today.
I have nothing more really to add, Mike. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope this conversation reaches others and they may find something of value in it too. And again, I'm really very touched by the way that the Secular Buddhist Network has developed and how you keep it as a living thing. Its website is a very active one. There's a lot of input coming in and stuff being shared. So this is all good.